A very good afternoon to everybody, and welcome to the official release of the 25-26 winter forecast. How is everybody doing on this, the 30th of November? Yes, I managed to get on time this evening. I usually run a couple of minutes behind, but I think I've managed to hit right on 1600 hours. So, are you enjoying your weekend so far? You can let me know in the live chat below. Yes, there has been a lot of work put into this. There has been a bit of stress, it has to be said, over the last few days, in particular, bouncing around with ideas and really struggling to kind of make a call on a couple of things. But we'll see how things go. We will do a little bit of chit chat, the usual kind of live stream stuff first, and try and build up the numbers, and then we'll take it from there. I'll basically talk through the written article that I will release at the end of today's live stream. So yep, I got a little haircut, shave for the big occasion. This is the biggest day of the calendar for Mark Weather here on YouTube. Always excited to release this winter forecast. It's the 16th consecutive European winter forecast, and I continue to ask the question every year, is this the last one or not? But yeah, obviously a lot of interest, a lot of people that are on the chat. Our very own William McKendry and his good lady were the first on today's live chat, so it's good to see yourselves. I do apologise if I butcher any names, by the way, but and also good evening to Crift Beast, I think it is. We've got Keith Johnson. Good evening to yourself. We've got Ez 47. Ez says, "Let's go." We've got Malky Irv. We've got our very own Paul James. Good afternoon to Paul. Hope you're well, my friend, and enjoying your weekend. F1 on in the background, so I'm happy. Yes, you've got the best of both worlds. Winter chat as well as the F1 in the background, and then thrown in for good measure, we've got some football going on as well. I don't know what the Rangers score is, but I dread I dread to look at the scoreline, because I know it was a 0-0 and we're into the second half. Good evening as well to S. Dol Carl. Like I say, I do apologise if I get it wrong, but we've also got Sing Splint, so we've got at least two of our moderators tuning in. I know Lindsay's in the background, she's trying to make the roast beef, not roast beef, roast pork we're having this evening. There goes the first muck up in my lines. So yeah, and Lindsay's also on as well. We've got our good friend of the channel, Paul Farwell, tuning in as well. Good afternoon to yourself. My dad down in Kirkintilloch. Good evening to yourself as well. Hope you're enjoying your restful week off from the church situation. And good afternoon as well to O'Sullivan Exeter Cleaning. So good afternoon to yourself. Hi Mark from Kinsale in Cork, Ireland. So thank you very much for tuning in. And also good afternoon to James Allen. So we've got plenty of new names popping up, which is great to see. We've got Kevin Barber tuning in as well. The Train and Nature Show is also tuning in. We've got 55 concurrent viewers at the minute. Be sure to hit that like button. But even better still, it doesn't cost you a single penny to hit that red button and hit subscribe to the channel. We have got a lot of interesting things going on out there, folks, both up above, but also globally as well. We'll look at the details in a short while. I also want to dedicate this live stream, because it is a special one, but I want to dedicate this to my late mum Joyce, who passed away unfortunately earlier this year, back on the 7th of April. I know she would have been tuning in to today's stream, so I just want to dedicate this live stream to her, and yeah, don't want to get too soppy or anything, but I thought it would be appropriate to dedicate this to my mum. So yeah, we've got 56 concurrent viewers at the moment here. I'm going to try and see if we can just get those numbers built up just a little bit more, and then we will get into the meat and bones. Thank you very much to Lindsay for the super chat. That is very kind of you. I appreciate that. And yeah, we did car hunting yesterday, and we did pick up a car. Pretty sad. 13 and a half years I've had my beloved Toyota Yaris. It's been up and down the length and breadth of the UK multiple times. It's done Land's End to John O'Groats, and John O'Groats back to Land's End. Not in a winner, but on separate occasions. And yeah, it's been over the Northern Ireland. It's been out in the Western Isles, and it is done. So it will be getting picked up by a truck hopefully later this week. And yes, it's the end of an era to the Yaris, but we picked up a nice little Ford Focus, and yeah, hopefully it serves us well. That's going to be Lindsay's car, because the other car is yeah, it's floating around in the background, but Lindsay's got herself a new car, so that's an early Christmas present for Lindsay. But yeah, shall we crack on then? Everybody is here to see what the verdict is with regards to winter, not me waffling a load of rubbish. But yeah, so let me go into this, and we will get going. So, very warm welcome to the 25-26 winter forecast from my very own myself, Mark Hogan. Welcome to the 16th consecutive winter forecast. In this forecast, the conclusions drawn for the upcoming meteorological winter period, which is December through February, is based on current climate state and global drivers at play, including the current SSTs, so that's the sea surface temperature anomalies, ENSO, so obviously that's El Nino La Nina, the Indian Ocean Dipole, the quasi-biennial oscillation, the QBO, and solar. So these are the drivers that are in place for the upcoming winter season. We've got weak La Nina conditions likely to go neutral as we progress through the upcoming winter season. We had the deepest negative Indian Ocean dipole since 1996. That is now fading away. We've got an easterly QBO, which is the winds within the stratosphere over the equator, and they basically bounce between westerlies and easterlies. We've got an easterly QBO this upcoming winter season. I say upcoming, it's the 1st of December tomorrow, so it really is hard to believe that we are now entering the not only the month of December, not only winter, but also the festive season as well. We've got a warm AMO and a cold PDO. So AMO, Atlantic Multi-Decadal Oscillation. It's generally been in this warm phase for the guts of 25, 30 years or so. The PDO, the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, tends to flip around between warm and cold a little bit more often than the Atlantic does. We're also coming off a solar maximum, which actually occurred last year, an unusually weak late autumn polar vortex. So a lot going on up in the stratosphere over the equator, not the equator, over the pole. So we'll look at that, and also where is the Madden-Julian oscillation going to go to? That could be pretty critical as well. So we've got S. Doll Carol, who has very kindly donated to the channel as well. That is very, very generous of you indeed, Carol. So thank you for that. Really do greatly appreciate everybody's fantastic support to the channel and to myself. But you can see here this graphic basically representing the players on the field and where they're generally positioned. We've obviously got our friend the polar vortex up in the Arctic. We've got this is actually this graphic was created back in September, so it's slightly out of date, this particular chart here. But we had back in the autumn season, we did have a record warm Pacific in the North Pacific. That is, we've got La Nina signal within the tropical Pacific. We've got the IOD, which is the Indian Ocean Dipole. When you've got waters cooler than average in the west versus a central and eastern warmer than average temperatures, that is a negative IOD. The MJO question mark, where is it going to position? The MJO being an area of convective thunderstorm activity that basically circumnavigates the tropics, and where that convection positions itself, whether it be in the Indian Ocean over the maritime continent, which is Indonesia, or the Western or Central Pacific, dictates the behavior of the atmosphere. And we'll look at that in a little bit more detail as well. We'll continue to see this ongoing warm AMO signal, or a positive AMO. We've got the easterly QBO, as already explained as well. But the tropics are basically the engine to the atmosphere. MJO, the easterly QBO, the Indian Ocean dipole, basically the tropics can really hold the key as to what type of global pattern we actually see here, whether it be the UK and Ireland, mainland Europe, North America, whatever. A lot of it is originated in the tropical portion of the planet. So the run up to the 25-26 season has a lot going for it. But as is often the case, there are things that we cannot ignore if you love winter weather. So in other words, we do have caveats to a lot of favorability with regard to the upcoming winter season, in terms of snow and cold. I know a lot of people don't like the cold, but there's a lot of people on this channel in particular that love snow and cold. And there is aspects that's very, very favorable for, for spells of decent winter weather this upcoming season. But there's always caveats to that. And, I try to be as honest in my assessment, in my analysis, in my study of what's going on around the world in terms of making this forecast. I've tried to be as honest as possible here. But, for example, we've got this La Nina combined with the easterly QBO. That tends to favour a weaker polar vortex. So we've got that easterly QBO, as I said. This is from a weather balloon that gets launched probably, I think it's on a daily basis, from Singapore. Singapore being very close to the equator. They throw a weather balloon up, and basically once the instrumentation hits the stratosphere, it's picking up those easterly winds within the stratosphere over the equatorial belt of the planet. And you can see a nice little graphic here showing the strength of the polar vortex versus an easterly QBO or a westerly QBO. We've got an easterly QBO at the minute, and we will have throughout the course of the winter season. That tends to lead to a weaker polar vortex. So you can see these two charts representing the strength of the polar vortex. Westerly, like I say, tends to lead to a stronger polar vortex. We tend to get less frictional effect in the jet stream, and therefore when you've got the winds blowing in unison, so in other words a westerly direction, you tend to power up not only the jet stream further north, but you also tend to have a stronger polar vortex as well. Opposite is the case when you've got an easterly QBO, tends to create a little bit of frictional drag further north, and therefore you've got greater possibilities in terms of a slower jet, further south jet. It tends to have a little bit less momentum within the atmosphere itself, so there it allows high pressure to build into higher latitudes. By doing so, that slows down the westerly momentum, and you increase the chance of not only weakening the polar vortex, but also allowing cold to sink south. So obviously this has a fair bit of technical element to it. So I know some people are going to struggle with this a little bit, but I'll try and make it as straightforward as possible. So we're just coming off a solar maximum. That was the case last year. So we essentially are still in a solar maximum. We're not that far off the maximum really when it's occurred, in the last 12 or so months. But how much of a direct or indirect influence this has, in the upcoming winter, for example, is pretty unknown. So there's not really an awful lot to say with regards to the ongoing solar maximum that we've got at the minute. Equally, where and how strong. So this is important. The La Nina that we've got at the minute, so that's that belt of cold water. You can see it right here. There's the Pacific Ocean bang slap in the middle of the chart. You've got the Atlantic here. You've got the Indian Ocean here. You've got your Eurasia, India, Australia. This is the maritime continent. So this is Indonesia. There's the belt of cold waters extending across the tropical Pacific. That is very important when it comes to other elements. We've also got colder waters up in the North Pacific. That might be a good sign, by the way. Originally, we were seeing some very warm waters up to the south of Alaska, to the west of Canada. That tends to support more high pressure in this general area. And the consequences of that can sometimes lead to more storminess, more Atlantic driven weather into Western Europe. But the fact that those waters have cooled in the North Pacific is a good thing. Still got that warm North Atlantic, as you can see here. But the position of that cold versus warm water within the tropics, that then dictates the MJO. And if it's amplified, if it's strong, if it's influential on the atmosphere further north from where that convection is, that can have a big impact in terms of the type of weather pattern. So you've got the La Nina, you've got the easterly QBO, you've got the Indian Ocean dipole in a negative state. That then drives other elements such as the Arctic Oscillation, North Atlantic Oscillation. That is something that we tend to focus on for cold outbreaks or mild, stormy. Essentially the tropics, like I keep saying, is the driving force behind such other teleconnections as the Arctic Oscillation, North Atlantic Oscillation, the polar vortex. Really starts off within the tropics. So we are in the midst of one of, if not the earliest, sudden stratospheric warming. You've heard it in the media in recent days. Whether it be major or minor, we did see a wind reversal back on Friday. I think the wind's only reversed for less than 24 hours, so that counts as a minor stratospheric warming as opposed to a major one. But this is probably the earliest strat warming since at least 2000, but you could go back to 1968 for the last time. So it's unusual to see such an early warming within the stratosphere, an early weakness. Remember, this is still the period where you would expect the polar vortex to become stronger and stronger. It usually peaks in intensity towards the solstice, coming up around about just under a month from now. It's very unusual to see this early weakening of the polar vortex. That could be a few things, including such things as the East QBO and the La Nina. But it's important how the ENSO, so the La Nina or El Nino, if you got that, the IOD, the QBO, affects the MJO. And I refer to the MJO a lot because it really is a very, very good tool at being able to determine within a relatively decent time frame, so you could be talking 10 to 14 days in advance, where that MJO goes, whether it be in phases. You can see this here. This is the phase diagram. So essentially phase 1 all the way to phase 8. Phase 1, you can have that both in the Central Pacific as well as the western portion of the Indian Ocean. So let me just go back. I hope you're still with me here. But the longer positioning, the longer term positioning of the warm versus cold water temperature anomalies in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific can have significant influence in where the MJO and its branches of rising and sinking air position, despite its normal rotation around the tropical planet. So, in other words, where you've got the warmer waters versus the colder waters, the warmer waters tends to be where the MJO wants to essentially return to, like a default position for that particular season. And where exactly that goes can determine whether you've got, mild, you've got stormy, or you've got indeed settled and colder conditions. That then has that knock-on effect to the polar vortex, to the Arctic Oscillation, to the North Atlantic Oscillation. It all depends on where those warm and cold waters reside. So the vertical ascent or descent within the atmosphere, driven by surface winds through the tropical Indian and Pacific Oceans, have the ability to drive the entire hemispheric pattern. So this is the building blocks, the worm getting these ideas from. This is not just off the cuff forecast, but it is based on fundamental hard research. And there's a couple of elements that they have thrown in, other folk have added in, which I thought was useful. So I'll credit people obviously where it's due. So yeah, the entire hemisphere can be driven by where the MJO goes, and also can drive the strength of the stratospheric polar vortex. So while the MJO isn't the be all and end all, when active and predictable, it can provide a big heads up on a particular pattern. For example, mild, zonal, stormy, you've got the phases 2, 3, 4. So they tend to be, when you've got the MJO generally in the Indian Ocean, that tends to lead to stronger jet, more zonal jet, and more active in terms of wet and windy, stormy, etc. When you've got it in phases 4 and 5, which is over Indonesia, again, tends to lead to higher pressure over Europe, tends to lead to more of a positive Arctic oscillation where the cold is then bottled up over the Arctic. You've also got a positive North Atlantic oscillation. That is the measure of pressure between Iceland and the Azores. Positive NAO tends to be when you've got lower pressure up towards Iceland, higher pressure down towards the Azores. West and southwesterly winds is the rule. But once you get the MJO, then pulling away from the maritime continent into phases 6, 7, even 8, that's when things start to get more interesting. You start to get a weakening of that westerly momentum. You start to see more in the way of pressure building from the mid latitudes up into the higher latitudes. That means that we start to release some of that cold air from the Arctic down into the mid latitude pattern. You can get warmth going north, you can get cold moving south. Still doesn't guarantee, by the way, cold in the UK or indeed Western Europe, but it certainly helps when you've got this MJO in the favourable phase and you've also got that AO, NAO flipping. So when you've got that phase 6 into 7 into 8, the result tends to lean towards, not guarantees it, but tends to lean more towards a negative Arctic oscillation, North Atlantic oscillation here. So are we leaning warm and stormy, or are we leaning more into the phases that they support high latitude blocking and colder conditions? Well, that is the golden question. We'll get to that in just a second. This is a general diagram here. There's your positive Arctic oscillation on the left. You've got your negative Arctic oscillation on the right. You can see here that when you've got it positive, the cold tends to be bottled up across the top. You've got a stronger westerly jet stream here, and essentially you're driving Pacific air across North America and Atlantic air across Europe. When you've got this undulating jet, you're releasing cold further south. You've got a negative Arctic oscillation as a consequence, where you've got higher pressure up towards the pole, and the jet becomes a lot more wavy. Like I say, nothing is guaranteed despite having favourable AO, NAO signals. This is the North Atlantic oscillation then, and when you've got either neutral to positive on the right here, it shows a stronger zonal jet, tends to lead to warmer and wetter conditions across the UK, Ireland, northern portions of Europe, cooler and drier through the Mediterranean, if you notice. Then on the left, you've got a negative North Atlantic oscillation. That's when you've got a block of high pressure that shuts down the effects of the Atlantic and tends to have the jet further north, allowing cold air to get drawn south into eastern North America as well as into western portions of Europe. That's what you're wanting if you're looking for a cold spell in winter. So while the background state of our climate is clearly warmer than it has been over the last 10 to 15 years, in the last 5 years we've significantly warmed. The last true winter here in the UK was 09-10, coldest for most since 1978-79. But we still can get cold spells. So the above teleconnections perhaps aren't quite as reliable as the ones were. So in other words, the warmer planet that we have means that such teleconnections that you tend to look for reliable forecasting, I think it's kind of tainted somewhat because you've got a warmer overall background state, whether it be the oceans, the land, or the atmosphere. You tend to have a warmer, so it's a little bit harder I think, to use these teleconnections, and I don't like to lean more towards these older analogs, back to the 40s, 50s, 60s, because obviously the planet was a lot cooler, the oceans were a lot cooler, and I think sometimes the warm and cool drove a particular atmosphere much more effectively. I could be wrong, but that's just my opinion. With this uniformed, warmer setup, I think it is a little bit harder to kind of then pinpoint certain things. So cold as well as mild or stormy spells are still predictable. So we still do have obviously elements of predictability depending on the strength of the stratospheric polar vortex, the El Nino versus the La Nina combined with MJO. Cold spells within our warmer world still rival those of the colder past. So an example of that was back after a sudden stratospheric warming in 2021. We did see temperatures at Braemar, for example, hit minus 23 Celsius. That was in fact the coldest in the UK since back to 1995. At the end of December 1995, when a cold spell allowed Glasgow to drop to minus 20 Celsius, minus 27 was achieved in Altahara that particular period as well. So the coldest temperature, February 2021, coldest in the UK since 1995. It surpassed the cold of 0910, December 2010, for example. Temperatures, albeit more sustained cold, we still got exceptional cold back, and that was only 4 years ago when you think about that. So, in other words, we can still get potent cold spells even in a warmer world. So the cold spells within our warmer world can still rival those of the colder past, albeit arguably shorter lived and less widespread. There's a lean towards warmer winters. The default is obviously warmer than it was, and the colder, it leans warmer in terms of the overall winter compared to the past. But colder winters still do happen and will happen even in a warmer future, though less frequent. Always remember our default in general here in the UK and Ireland is from the Atlantic. So autumn 2025 has seen an interesting combination of weak La Nina, East QBO, negative IOD combined with a polar vortex. This is much weaker than normal. So very interesting parameters to play with this upcoming season. I believe it's no coincidence that we have a weak polar vortex as we enter this meteorological winter. The weak vortex even attributed to the unusual SSW, which occurred back in September over Antarctica, and we're also seeing a final stratospheric warming down in the southern hemisphere, simultaneous to the warming within the stratosphere in the North Pole. And there is a connection there, by the way, if you look up the Brewer-Dobson circulation, and this little graphic here shows that quite nicely. Don't have enough time to explain all that just at the minute here, but it's interesting how we've got stratospheric warmings going off simultaneously between the South and the North Pole. So, so we've got this cooling of the tropical troposphere with warming of the stratosphere over both poles simultaneously. This could be why that we've got a very amplified Mann-Julian oscillation at the moment, and that may be attributing to the stronger MJO with this warming of both stratospheres over both poles. It actually cools the troposphere over the tropical Pacific. It's important to think layers when it comes to our atmosphere and indeed the polar vortex. There's two main vortices. The tropospheric vortex, which is closest to Earth, which is heavily influenced by planetary waves and land friction, while stratospheric vortex is on the top of that. So you've got the troposphere, lowest portion of the atmosphere. That's where our weather resides. All the weather happens and takes place. And on top of that, you've got the stratosphere. And the stratospheric polar vortex tends to be much stronger, much more circular, with less friction the further away from Earth's surface you go. And this graphic here very nicely depicts the two polar vortexes. One larger vortex, which is within the troposphere, tends to be a lot more spread out, a lot more affected by frictional land. So obviously you've got the weather, you've got mountains which cause the jet stream to wobble, weaken, accelerate, whereas you've got less in the way of friction the further up through the atmosphere you go. So, the weaker polar vortex, due to various outside forces, suggests a weaker, wavier polar jet stream circling the hemisphere, separating tropical versus polar air masses. This weaker vortex and subsequent weaker jet stream, as a consequence of the weaker vortex, potentially provides greater opportunity for amplification and release of Arctic air southwards away from the pole, but equally subtropical air can then head northwards, while the big picture reflects greater variability. Where the warm and cold settles is a weaker polar vortex setup is harder to pinpoint. So in other words, even when you've got this weaker polar vortex, this release of Arctic air into the middle altitude pattern, exactly where that warm and cold sets up is very difficult to pinpoint, and that's very important. So in other words, you can have all the ingredients coming together very nicely, and still here in the UK, Ireland, or Western Europe, you can still have a warmer than average pattern due to ridging, for example, setting up directly overhead. Factors such as the La Nina, which is longer term, and the MJO, which is the shorter term, can sometimes, but not always, determine both the strength of the polar vortex and distribution of warm and cold air masses. We've a clearly weak or very weak stratospheric polar vortex heading into the winter. So we've got this rare late November strat warming. So this could be very important as we head into the December period, the beginning of winter. Weather driven by the combination of La Nina, East QBO, IOD, and also the earlier southern hemisphere stratospheric warming, which doesn't happen as many times as what you see up here in the northern hemisphere. We've just witnessed an extremely unusual November SSW over the North Pole with wind reversal, albeit brief, which constitutes a minor event as opposed to a major event. So look at this here. This is at the 10 millibars, the upper stratosphere. You've got this strong burst of warming coming out of East Asia across the top of the pole, leaning more towards the North American side of the pole, which doesn't really constitute a great signal for cold in the west of Europe here. And you can see the mean zonal wind in this graphic. The stronger the mean zonal wind, the stronger the polar vortex. The weaker those winds are, the weaker the polar vortex, and the greater chance of seeing that cold getting released further south. So you can see here it's below the zero line, so the winds circulating around the stratospheric polar vortex have indeed very briefly reversed from rather than the westerly, it's been more easterly. We do see a recovery taking place. Then we see a secondary weakening of this vortex towards the period around between the 20th and the 25th, 26th of December. Exactly the reasons why that is the case will remain to be seen. This is the 10 millibar rise in temperature, so the upper stratospheric warming showing up here. The grey line represents the average, so we actually went colder than average, and then temperature shot through the roof with that warming. Then the 30 millibar level, so slightly down through the stratosphere. Again, you can see this sharp warming in the stratosphere, and really a major sudden stratospheric warming is when you see the temperature rise by about 50 Celsius in a very short period of time. So a pool of cold builds through the autumn, peaking in strength usually around the solstice. Stronger the circulation, the colder the core and the winds are around it. What causes it to weaken, stretch, split, or collapse? With strong vertical heat release from the MJO or strong high pressure cells circulating around the higher latitudes. So remember that the troposphere is actually a shallower layer over the pole as opposed to the tropics, where it's a much greater depth. So obviously when you get these bulging areas of high pressure, especially up towards the Arctic region, tends to actually increase the depth of the troposphere. It contracts the stratosphere, and that's what happens when you get this frictional effect. It starts off as a ripple within the stratospheric circulation, then that ripple can progress to become more in the way of wave action, and that's what I go on to say here. Ripples with enough force, warm warm it creates a warming to take place. Those ripples can turn into waves, which cause distortion of the circulation. This causes the polar night jet, that's the mean zonal winds, to rapidly weaken and buckle. When these waves, which start to gain momentum, can cause the entire polar vortex to reverse, stretch, or split, and also collapse. This is known as a major SSW when those winds reverse and the temps within the stratospheric polar vortex warm by as much as 50 Celsius in a few days. However, this energy must, and this is important, you can get sudden stratospheric warming and have little to no effect down here at the surface. You need to get that energy to then propagate down into the troposphere to affect our weather pattern. So the downstream reflection is very, very important. Let me just have a quick bite of this pork. Gives me a little second to what do you call it, to just get my breath back for a second. So just bear with me, folks. So it's important to see higher pressure propagate down through the atmosphere from stratosphere to troposphere. But furthermore, where that region sets up is very, very important. So as we enter December, we're observing an amplified phase 6 of the MJO heading into phase 7. That's cold phases, by the way. That favours colder weather as we head into the month of December. So on paper, that's a good thing if you're looking for cold. In a standardized state, the central based La Nina combined with the IOD drives strong westerlies over the Indian Ocean and easterlies over the Pacific, with convergence of those winds that meet typically over Indonesia, maritime continent, or the West Pacific, which often drives a milder European pattern. But throw in the easterly QBO, and that changes the playing field. But notice in the below graphic, this is shared by Eric Webb, the pattern flips from cold to warm as you progress through winter. So there's a lot of parameters, folks, that is pointing towards cold into the month of December. So look at this graphic here. I know it's a little bit hard to see. Hopefully, if you're watching on your smart TV, you can see this a bit clearer. Northern Hemisphere monthly NOAA 20th century reanalysis of the surface low pressure anomalies. This is the combination of having a QBO that is easterly versus westerly, the solar cycle. So we've got high solar activity, we've got an easterly QBO, and we've got a La Nina situation at the minute here. And this area, this column highlighted up here, shows that December has that high latitude blocking, that blocking over the Atlantic with a trough, low pressure, cold air into Europe in the month of December when you've got this combination. But you notice here, January continues with that. We'll lose that deep trough, but still, it's a favourable pattern for cold in the month of January. But then into February and March, the pattern turns on its head and actually becomes milder. We've got, for example, high pressure through the mid latitudes, lower pressure up towards the Arctic, a mild situation for the mid latitude hemisphere. So this, based on this pure on its own, you've got a blocking and a cold favourable pattern December and January. Throw in what's going on in the stratosphere, that's even reinforcing that. We've also got, this doesn't incorporate the MJO, which is in a favourable phase for cold as well. So it's pointing towards colder through the first half of the winter season. I'm particularly interested in past years with the above drivers in place, along with the weakening late autumn vortex connection between UK and November flood events. Remember, we had the big floods in the Monmouthshire area of Wales back a couple of weeks ago. That then made me start to think about UK flash flood events linked with cold spells in the past. So, as well as the above, I want to explore another element: warm, wet Novembers and Novembers which flipped from warm to cold. Remember, we did flip this November to something considerably colder with snow compared to what we had through the first half of November. Many moons ago, Joe Bastardi, who is chief meteorologist at weatherbell.com based in New York, said that where the wettest weather focuses in autumn, and particularly late autumn, i.e. November, that's where the cold wants to go to. The recent flooding of November 25 combined with the MJO progression, so we've got that negative IOD, East QBO, La Nina, to years which turned cold in December, following on from flooding in the month of December. We all remember, do we remember the floods of autumn 2000? Cumbria 2009, that Cockermouth floods, Cornwall 2010, and Monmouthshire 2025, question mark. And Richard Trott provided some interesting analysis that they looked at wet Novembers with the cold December, which followed on 1950, 1952, 52, 50, 62, 81. That was a very cold December. 95, we had a cold December then. 96, remember that we've just seen the lowest negative IOD since 1996. 2010 is in there, and 2022, which had a cold December. That was our last cold December. That followed on from a significant wet spell during the month of November. And there are some parts of the UK that's well in excess of 150% of normal rainfall for this November. But interesting, and you can read that at your leisure. This, by the way, this is from Eric Webb. There's a few things that I've added in from Eric Webb, based in the United States. This is La Nina Decembers combined over the last 30-year period. And you notice here that we've got this notable blocking signal here. Greenland, Arctic, we've got the trough over North America, the trough over Europe. That is a pretty textbook negative AO, NAO pattern that delivers the cold and the snow. So this is the last 30 years with December La Ninas. I thought that was quite an interesting look, wasn't it? So those years include 2022, 21, 2020, 2017. So there is warm years in there as well as cold years. 2016, 2011, 2010. So there's big cold Decembers in there. 2008, 2007, 2005, 2000. That is a key analog this year is 2000, 2001. And that was a pretty cold Christmas and New Year. Hint, hint. 1999's in there, 1998, 96, and 95. And when you combine them all, this is how it's looking. And that certainly is a winter weather lover's dream. So we've also got early stratospheric warmings that occurred in the month of November back to 58, 68, and 2000. 2000 really is popping up. This is what the 50 millibar level, so this is the lower stratosphere, looked in the month of November. And this is how the month of December looked in the 500 millibar level. And again, you've got that negative connecting North America with Europe, the block over the top in those years. So this is December 58, 68, and 2000. Let's have a look at the 500 millibar geopotential heights in recent past years, which had a December of a similar warming within the stratosphere combined with a MJO that is rotating into phases 6, 7, and 8. So you've got the combination of a similar warming within the stratosphere at the minute and a similar MJO. And what stands out, 2017 actually stands out because you can see the rotation out of the warm phases of the Indian Ocean through the maritime continent and then into the Western and Central Pacific. The blue represents the MJO during the month of December. This is how the 500 millibar looked in 2017. It wasn't actually an overly cold December, but look at the amount of blocking North Atlantic extending up over Greenland into the Arctic region. You've got the trough over mainly over Central and Eastern Europe in December 17, and you've also got a trough into the eastern side of North America. So that was 2017 with a similar MJO and strat warming to this year. 2000 again stands out. Look at the rotation out of the Indian Ocean maritime continent through phases 6, 7, and 8, albeit it's not quite as amplified as what we have at the minute. Let's have a look at the current MJO situation. So this is how it's looking as we head out of November and into the month of December. It's strong in phase 7. It may creep into phase 8, and that certainly is a cattle prod to the atmosphere that supports blocking, supports cold. It supports this type of situation here. This is the ENSO, East QBO, and solar max year since 1900. So you can see the evidence building for favourable blocking in the favourable areas that support cold here in the UK and Western Europe. So that's 2000. That is how 2000 looked from the 500 millibar point of view. Again, you've got this similar repetition of that block over Greenland, over the Arctic region, with a link up of trough underneath. In December of 2009, again, cold and snowy run up to Christmas, we had a similar MJO rotation through phases 6, 7, and 8. Like we have this time around, it turned cold around about the 17th of the month, and then it turned very cold and snowy around the Christmas New Year period. And this is how the MJO looked. Yeah, it was more in the null phase, but you notice here that it entered a more amplified phase 7 and 8 towards the back half of December. This is how 2009 looked, December of 2009, with again that block over the top. So there is conflicting signals going on though. So being honest, I've had a struggle this week. Really struggled, really scratching my head for the last week and even past few weeks. And my gut has been swaying back and forward regarding the potential outcome of this upcoming winter season, the early winter, as well as most of the winter overall. My mind keeps going back to 2013, folks. And that particular month in 2013 had a similar warming up in the stratosphere. We were seeing lobes of Arctic air getting drawn southwards over North America. But in turn, that parred up the Atlantic jet and threw a series of lows our way in that particular month in 2013. Also, what comes to mind is 2005, 2015 comes to mind as well. So there's some quite warm Decembers in there. 2013 wasn't overly warm, but it was very stormy. We also had a record wind gusts up at Stornoway. We had the lowest sea level pressure recorded in the UK since in over 100 years. Back in 2013, when we had that supercharged jet fueled by the Arctic air that was getting dumped into North America. So we know that the polar vortex is likely to remain at the very least weak through the month of this December coming up. So the polar vortex is going to be weaker than average through the month of December 2025. That in itself raises the opportunity for a blocking pattern and the release of cold south. And La Nina winters tend to be colder during the first half, milder during the second half. On the other hand, due to the cold waters extending west towards the date line of the Pacific, the La Nina tends to hold the MJO in warmer phases. So in other words, phases 1 or 2, into 3, into 4 and 5, that tends to, that's warmer or wetter or stormier phases. So the La Nina that we've got at the minute is, telling us that it's wanting to keep the MJO in those warmer, stormier phases. So whether it be over the Indian Ocean or the maritime continent. both of which favour milder Atlantic-driven weather in the Western Europe. That being said, the La Nina is expected to fade through this upcoming winter season, probably through January or February. It'll probably turn neutral, which might be too late to have significant difference in the atmospheric response, but warm those waters in the Central Pacific and the MJO might head more towards phases 6, 7, and 8, which are colder, blockier phases. Hope you're still with me here, folks. I know this is a bit long-winded, and I know, but I'm trying to build the evidence to support the outcome that is coming up shortly. So hang fire and perhaps put your dinner on hold. But so most models show a weaker than normal mean zonal wind and polar vortex pretty much throughout winter. So I'll show you the models in just a second. So that would favour cold, that would favour blockiness up into the high latitudes and cold into the mid latitudes. Therefore, the positive AO-NEO pattern later January. So I suspect that we could see a strengthening of the polar vortex mid to late winter, which would turn the AO-NEO into a positive state later January, February, which drives a milder second half of the winter. Now, that would relate to a La Nina type winter. You tend to have colder first, then a milder second. So let's have a quick look at some of the models then. I want to show you what is going on with regards to the mean zonal wind projected by the models. You can see here the black line represents average, and the thick blue line is the ensemble mean. This is off the ECMWF model here, and you can see a clear signal of below average mean zonal wind, so a weaker polar vortex continuing from around the beginning of December, which is pretty much spot on, and it remains weaker than average all the way through till the end of January, possibly beginning of February. That's quite an interesting signal. If we look at the JMA, which is the Japanese Meteorological Agency, you can see it too goes weaker than average at the beginning of meteorological winter and remains weaker than average all the way to March, which is quite interesting. You can see here off the DWD, which is the German model, again, same idea. So there's the consensus showing up in the models, weaker than average mean zonal wind all the way through meteorological winter. So that's interesting, isn't it? This is the UK Met model here showing the same story. So yeah, there's pretty strong consensus in the longer range model, and this is all model runs for the month of November, by the way, showing that we've got weaker than normal mean zonal winds within the stratosphere above the pole. So some thoughts with regards to the overall situation. I've obviously highlighted the drivers that we've got in place, but while there's plenty of positives for a cold perspective heading into December, I feel there's a lot of unknowns with the simple non-compliant ingredient, which could, so a simple one teleconnection, one element, one ingredient, which could make for two very different outcomes. For example, the type of strat warming can be different. The difference between a 2010 easterly or a 2013 Atlantic battering, or just plain old born mild high pressure. So you've got three different outcomes. You know, the super cold December of 2010, super stormy of 2013, or just a kind of nondescript December. And it could be, you know, a fine detail like the wrong type of stratospheric warming that could throw everything into chaos. Essentially, a seemingly very similar setup of ingredients can deliver a wide variety of the aforementioned results. So based on the latest guidance, what we know at the minute, the troposphere doesn't look likely to absorb this recent Canadian warming. So in other words, it's not filtering down through the atmosphere, and therefore this type of strat warming favours cold for North America and zonality and a flow increase linking Europe and the Atlantic. So Atlantic driven weather is likely through the first half of this upcoming December season. And I've been highlighting that for some time. The 50 millibar level, so this is the lower portion of the stratosphere, is something that I like to look at for possible reflection beneath and into the 500 millibar pattern. So what goes on in the lower stratosphere can sometimes reflect the atmosphere within the troposphere, and that magic 500 millibar level lasting 1 to 2 weeks after the initial. So this is the 50 millibar level warming within the stratosphere, the lower stratosphere, as of tomorrow, Monday, the 1st of December. And you notice the focus of that warming is more towards North America. You've also got a belt of cooler temperatures from eastern North America towards southwestern Europe here. This tends to favor that cold dumping into North America, stronger Atlantic jet, and low pressure and Atlantic weather moving into the west of Europe here. So this is clearly showing up through the first week of December, both in the 500 millibar and the temperature anomaly here. So this is the 500 millibar pattern for week 1 of December. Notice here that we've got this ridge over the North Pacific. We've got this trough over Hudson Bay. You've got that direct channel for cold air, outbreaks of Arctic air to drop into the eastern side of North America. But you've got that elongated ridge of high pressure through the subtropical Atlantic. The ridge positioned in such a way with the troughs that it favors Atlantic-driven weather into Europe here. Therefore, we've got the upcoming 7 days. It's actually bitterly cold across North America, and that cold looks as if it's going to extend well into the month of December. Notice here that we do have a little bit of a mixture of both warmer and colder versus the average across Europe. But I feel slightly less concerned today compared to much of the past week. And in fact, what's going on over the pole, we'll see changes. So what we're seeing at the minute here within the stratosphere is going to start to change. We're going to start to lose that strong momentum, allowing the effects of the MJO. So at the minute, we're actually seeing the strat warming and the MJO work against one another, even though they both on paper favor cold in Western Europe. They're actually working against each other at the minute here. But what we are going to see is we're going to see changes taking place that allows the favourable MJO phase 7 to take over through the month of December, and through the second half of December, it's looking more likely to see blocking begin to develop over the higher latitudes. And again, where the ridge trough couplet sits is going to be critical for us here in Western Europe. But you can see here that amplified phase 7 of the MJO, and that in a La Nina year. Bottom right hand corner of this graphic shows the favourable setup here for downward coupling, negative Arctic oscillation, North Atlantic oscillation, and cold into Western Europe as well as Eastern North America. So I hope this makes sense, and I hope it's not too long-winded for you. So to reinforce this thought that the MJO becomes more favourable and the pattern becomes more favourable for cold, if we look at the 50 millibar level, so that's the lower stratosphere, and this is for later December, and there's a more favourable blocking position over Greenland. You notice here that the warming, the positive heights are much more incorporating the north of the planet, including Greenland, including the North Atlantic here. And if we look at the 500 millibar pattern towards the period between Sunday the 21st of December and Sunday the 20th of December, you notice here that we're starting to see a high pressure cell building to the north of the UK as well as Ireland. And that is backing up what I'm saying to you with regards to the stratosphere, MJO, etc., etc. Now to the crunch. So there are signs of further warming within the stratosphere through, and just as mentioned, type of warming and downward absorption is key. But there is evidence to support that we're going to continue to see another wave of warming through the stratosphere as we progress through the month of December. So the forecast. I know it's a long-winded way of getting there, but this is the forecast for the winter of 25-26, everybody. December 2025. December is very tricky, but there's two elements which favour cold, but they're working against each other as explained. And the other can deliver quite the different type of pattern. This is for December, I'm going with a generally mild, wet, west to southwesterly setup through the first half of December. So through the first 10 to 14 days, I think the Atlantic is going to be the driving element to our pattern, but there is change between the 10th, 15th, possibly the 20th of December. So a slowing of the flow of momentum that is going to allow pressure to build north of the UK and Ireland region. Perhaps a Scandinavian bloc developing here, who knows? I believe we have a slightly increased chance of, say, 60% of a colder Christmas New Year period with north to northeasterly or indeed easterly winds developing. So the mild first half, colder second half to December is what I think, with a storm or two possible as well. All in all, for the month of December, average to above average temperatures. So could well be a warmer than average December. It depends on how much mildness we get through the first half versus the second half. And again, this is all open to question. Depends on the finer details. Average rainfall with variability across the UK and Ireland. What about January, turn of the year? Coming off the back of a cold new year, providing continued weak polar vortex and downwelling in the troposphere, there's a good chance, like observed last year. Remember last December, January was actually quite cold. Temperatures down to minus 18.9 at Altahara. That was the coldest January night since 2010 last year. I think we could see something similar this time around, with a prolonged spell of cold with decent opportunity for heavy snowfalls across many or most of the UK and Ireland, as well as the near continent. A firmly negative AO-NAO setup through the first half of January, with the coldest weather of winter setting in. So the worst of winter being at the turn of the year. Widespread days below freezing, with nights widely -5 to -10, with prone cold spots in northern England and Highlands witnessing another run at -20 Celsius. The second half of January sees a thaw as the MJO heads into either the stormier phases of 2 and 3 or the mild 4 and 5. Colder, drier than average month as a whole in January 2026 for the UK and Ireland and much of Western Europe, including France, the Low Countries, and Scandinavia. So we have this cold first half, milder second half, based on the overall thinking. So we've got likely an average to slightly warmer than average December, likely a cooler than average January. As we move into the back half of the winter, what does 2026 February look like? Average to above average temperatures and rainfall for much of Western Europe, with a strengthening of the polar vortex. That would then lead to a positive AO-NAO driven pattern with the MJO in warmer phases. This below graphic, which I created back in September, the outcome even in December, if that strat warming was the wrong type and the MJO doesn't behave itself, there is a lean towards this possible scenario where you've got a weak polar vortex, even a stratospheric warming situation, but it favours North America as opposed to Europe here. There is this niggle in my gut that makes me think, if we did happen to get high pressure building over the North Pacific, for example, send the jet north, allowing the cold waves to move into the eastern side of North America, my concern would be, with a wrong strat warming, that we would have lower pressure affecting, a strong jet across the Atlantic and into Western Europe. That is something that I can't shake this feeling of, folks, with regards to the upcoming season here, but we'll wait and see. So, for the winter as a whole, I must state the confidence is lower than I would like it to be due to conflicting signals. I have to say that my gut is leaning me towards the milder side of average in temperature and weather also for the December through February period, with December and February both looking warmer. That tips the balance for the season overall. I do think we are going to see spells of cold. They could be quite notable. They could be fairly prolonged through the heart of winter. That period between the 20th of December and the 20th of January, I think, is going to be that window of where we could see the coldest, snowiest conditions. But I do think it's a bit of a bookend of milder and possibly wetter, possibly stormier first half of December and through a chunk of February. So yeah, believe it or not, I am going for a warmer than average, wetter than average winter overall. But like I said, there is opportunities out there. I hope you've enjoyed this. My voice is about to give up on me. I have now spoken for over an hour. You can obviously watch this back at your leisure, and also I'm about to hit the publish button on marfogandweather.com. So this, what I've read out, is going to be freely available for you to check that out. But I hope you've enjoyed what you've seen. I hope you've appreciated the background work to come to this conclusion, and we'll wait and see what happens. From tomorrow onwards, we do know that we are going to have a relatively mild beginning to winter. Which starts obviously tomorrow from a meteorological standpoint. But we'll wait and see. I'm reasonably confident that we will see the pressure build in the right areas that would deliver a cold spell during the second half of December. And who knows, could we see a cold and snowy Christmas period and lasting through New Year? We haven't seen that since 2010, and it would be fantastic to see. So, yeah, massive thank you to folks that have donated. Massive thank you for hanging in there. It's been a long one. I do appreciate that. It's been very technical as well. But excellent forecast, Mark. I strongly agree with you, says Kevin King. Mike also saying, so sorry, it's we are not going to have a cold winter anymore next winter, and the same. So we'll wait and see. La Nina is likely to transition to El Nino come next year. We'll probably have an El Nino summer next year and an El Nino winter next year as well. That could be quite interesting. Mark Kinnish saying thanks. Paul James saying excellent forecast live stream. Thanks for all your hard work. Absolute pleasure, Paul, and thank you for the kind words, my friend, and your ongoing support. Thank you to Sing Splint, Lindsay, to Paul James for the ongoing support through moderating the channel. It is very, very appreciated. Kevin Barber saying 2018 here in Harwich, the Beast did deliver. And there is plenty of opportunity out there, by the way, for interesting things. 4 weeks, I meant all Jan. So the last time I seen cold east winds was in the 80s. We had east winds for 3 weeks and ice days, 90s, 2000s, and the rest. We get 2 or 3 days of cold, and the rest of winter is mild. Yeah, it's a fair opinion. We'll wait and see what happens this year. Stephen King saying, Stephen King 626, could the beast from the east be unleashed in January, Mark? That is very possible. And like I said, also it could go the opposite way depending on little key fundamentals. In a nutshell, more chance of cold, snowy weather in the UK in December and January, flipping milder and stormy in February. Yep, that is pretty much it, in my opinion, anyway. We've got Peter Lavington 9261. I noticed that Bering Sea has closed now. Usually it gets iced over by around the 6th of December. Mark, you're playing a blinder, clear and decisive as ever, says Kevin. And Kevin's a fantastic support of the channel. Thank you very much, Kevin, for that. And yeah, I hope, let's wait and see what happens. Maybe it'll be my last one if it's a disaster, and I hope I haven't kind of just thrown everything out there. It's not a case of you put everything on the table and then you're not going to make a fool of yourself as much. But I just feel that there's a lot of S, buts, and maybes. There's a lot of close calls. I had haggis for my dinner, and it's St Andrew's Day, says Turbo Stream. Yeah, St Andrew's Day. Is it? I didn't realise that actually for some reason. MJL, I love you. Kevin says a lot of unsettled weather. Player has played its part. J Player L10 says it's been really cool month here in Portugal. Thanks for tuning in from Portugal. JLJ Player 10. Kevin says, I can't wait to see that player. Years gone by, America and Europe both could be both cold, but not in the modern age. It really depends, Kevin, on the situation. But yeah, I agree with where you're coming from with that. Adam Blunson saying partly it's going to be more flooding. Apparently, it's going to be more flooding tomorrow. So yeah, that kind of drives home this point. That's why December 2015 slightly concerns me at the same time as well. Metsut saying, don't think we will get any cold this December. And who knows? It might be right. So yeah, City Andy saying, I think we'll get a cold mid-month. We will. So yeah, I think, and Darth Vader was also tuning in. Good evening to Darth Vader in Sweden. So right, let's go then. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you enjoy the rest of your Sunday and weekend. Join me tomorrow where I will fine tune the December outlook. So we'll look through the December forecast in tomorrow's video, usually published at around 5 p.m. So thanks for watching, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day, and I'll see you tomorrow with the European Outlook. Bye bye.